Hey friends, tonight we begin with a story often left untold, the quiet resilience of medieval peasants. These were not the warriors in shining armor, or the names etched into royal scrolls. These were the men and women who endured the coldest winters, who found warmth, not in fire, but in one another. Through makeshift insulation, shared body heat, and simple wisdom passed down through generations, they survived night after night with nothing but ingenuity, grit, and quiet determination. If you've ever wondered how ordinary people survived extraordinary hardship, or if you simply enjoy drifting off to gentle stories of the past, this video is for you. So if you find comfort here in the quiet, in the history and the storytelling, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps this little corner of the internet stay alive. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it there? I'd love to know who's joining this peaceful journey from across the world. Now, dim the lights. Let the room fall still. And together we'll slip into the soft, forgotten edges of medieval life. When you think of the medieval world, your imagination might leap straight to knights in shining armor, jousting tournaments, and grand halls with roaring feasts. But for the ordinary peasant, winter nights were not about revelry or adventure. They were about survival. Survival not in the dramatic sword-fighting sense, but in the quiet, slow, teeth-chattering sense. Winter wasn't just a season, it was a test that returned every year, and not everyone passed. Imagine you are living in a tiny hut made of sticks and mud. The kind of place where the walls are so thin you can hear the wind sighing through the cracks, and sometimes even hear the birds sneeze outside. There is no insulation, of course. No fireplace carved from stone. No windows. Or rather, there might be a hole in the wall stuffed with an animal hide which you'd pray wouldn't blow away in the night. The inside temperature of your home was only slightly better than whatever the weather was doing outside. If it was freezing outdoors, it was just a polite 2 or 3 degrees warmer inside. Nights were the worst. The darkness crept in early and stayed long. There were no lights, no screens, no distractions. Just the sound of the wind moving like a ghost past your home and the dim glow of a sputtering fire. If you were lucky enough to sit closest to the hearth, you might feel your toes thaw, but for those on the other side of the room, there was little comfort. You might as well have been sleeping outside, just with a roof over your head. And then came the cold. The kind of cold that doesn't just sting your skin, but sits deep in your bones. Clothing, as you might expect, was less a matter of fashion and more of hope. Peasants didn't have access to thick fur cloaks or layers of down feathers. Most owned 1 or 2 woolen tunics. Maybe a cloak that smelled permanently of goat, and perhaps a threadbare cap to keep your ears from turning blue. You would put on everything you had, sometimes all at once, transforming yourself into what could only be described as a human onion, a figure of layers and creases and discomfort. And yet, no matter how many layers you wore, the cold would find its way in. Beds, if they could even be called that, didn't help much either. A peasant's bed was often a sack stuffed with straw or hay placed directly on the cold earth. There were no mattresses, no quilts, and certainly no sheets. You lay down knowing the straw beneath you would slowly flatten into a mat of dust and chaff, and knowing that somewhere in that mass, fleas were already preparing for a midnight feast. Still, sleep was necessary. So you lay there, curled up tightly, wearing your only tunic, perhaps with your cloak pulled over your head. You pulled your knees to your chest, trying to warm yourself with your own breath, whispering into the darkness that maybe, just maybe, the morning would come. The fire helped when it lasted. The hearth, often no more than a shallow pit or a few stones ringed together, served as the heart of the home. But there were no chimneys. The smoke lingered swirling slowly across the low ceiling, stinging eye, and soaking into every scrap of cloth and skin. It made breathing difficult, but in a strange way, it helped fumigate the fleas. When you lived in a place where the walls were made of dung and straw, and your neighbors were livestock, a little smoke in the lungs was just part of the price of warmth. Banking. The fire was a nightly ritual. You couldn't afford to let it die out, not just because restarting it was a chore involving flint steel and far more patience than you had in the cold, but because letting the fire go out meant letting the cold win. So families would cover the glowing embers with ash, hoping to preserve a bit of heat until morning. If done right, the fire could be coaxed back to life with a bit of dry wood and effort. If done wrong, well, the night just got longer. Sometimes survival meant huddling together. Everyone, parents, children, elders, crammed into the same corner of the room. Limbs entangled, breaths shared, trying to trap body heat like a precious currency. Even the animals, cows, goats, pigs, joined in. Not for affection, but for warmth. The line between home and barn dissolved completely. Livestock wandered freely inside. Their warmth, their bodies, their mere presence, it all helped tip the balance against death. Winter for a medieval peasant was not beautiful. It was not cozy. It was not the setting for storybook cheer. It was a gauntlet of patience and endurance. And each night survived was quietly celebrated not with joy or wine, but with the simple act of waking up. And so, when you close your eyes tonight beneath your soft duvet in your room with double-paned windows and central heating, take a moment to imagine a world where warmth wasn't assumed, it was fought for. A world where staying alive through the night was not a given, but a victory. By the time the first frost arrived, the work was already done, or at least whatever work could be. In medieval life, winter was not just a season. It was an exam you spent all year preparing for. The harvest, the drying, the salting, the pickling, these were not choices. They were the prerequisites for surviving the months when the earth would sleep and nothing new could be coaxed from it. For the peasant, there was no going to the market for food. There was no grocery list, no last-minute shopping. What you had in your home by mid-autumn was what you would live on or die on until spring. Grains were precious. Barley, rye, oats, not always fresh and never luxurious, were stored in sacks made of whatever cloth could be spared. Mice were an eternal threat. Rats even worse. So families often hung their stores from the ceiling beams, suspended above the dirt floor like edible chandeliers. It wasn't foolproof, but it was better than nothing. Vegetables were stored in root cellars or buried beneath hay. Potatoes wouldn't arrive in Europe until centuries later. So instead, they relied on turnips, parsnips, and cabbages, foods that modern palates might shun. But for medieval peasants, they were dependable allies. Protein was harder. A pig might be slaughtered in late autumn and every part used. The meat was salted, the fat rendered the organs cooked quickly and eaten with thanks. What couldn't be eaten right away was smoked dried or simply stored and hoped over. Fish, when available, might be dried or pickled, but for many, the only meat during winter was the memory of it. And yet they endured. Hunger, like the cold, was not a sudden visitor. It was a slow companion, one that taught you how to stretch a meal. A single loaf of bread might last days. Broth thin, sometimes just water, and herbs could be served again and again, each time tasting less of food and more of firewood. Firewood itself was another enemy. You didn't just burn what you found. Wood was collected in summer, dried and stacked in whatever space you had. But the stack always felt smaller in winter, like it was shrinking behind your back. Every log you burned was a decision. Would you be warm tonight or tomorrow? In some villages, peasants were allowed to gather dead wood from the Lord's forest, but the rules were strict. You couldn't cut trees, only pick what had already fallen. And even then there were watchers men who would fine you, or worse if you took more than your share. So you rationed your fire like you rationed your bread. One burn in the morning, one in the evening. The hours between were left to fate and cloaks and closeness. Time passed slowly. There was no work to do in the fields, no daylight after early afternoon. So people sat. They mended tools. They repaired clothing. They spoke sometimes in whispers, sometimes not at all. Some told stories not for entertainment, but for survival. A long story could distract from a grumbling belly. A funny story could make the cold feel less sharp. The church was ever present, and winter was full of feast days and fasts. But for peasants, the distinction between the two blurred. A feast might be a thicker soup. A fast might be the same soup without barley. They obeyed not always because of faith, but because obedience was safe, predictable, structured. Children learned early that asking for more was pointless. They shared what there was and grew up with hunger as a familiar ache. Not pain, not danger, just hunger. Like the cold, it became part of life. Something you lived with, not something you fought. And yet life went on. Couples married in winter, not in summer, because the fields were quiet. Children were born wrapped in wool and hope. Songs were sung soft, repetitive melodies meant more to soothe than to celebrate. Even in hardship, people found rhythm. A kind of peace not from comfort, but from habit. Because that was the true secret to surviving the cold. Not wealth, not strength, not fire, but routine. The same soup, the same cloak, the same slow walk to the latrine, the same prayer before sleep. Predictability was warmth. Familiarity was safety. The snow outside could fall as it pleased. The winds could howl and shake the walls. But inside, people held on to one another, to habit, to the stubborn belief that spring would come. And often, it did. If warmth was the goal of every medieval winter night, then clothing was the armor. Not armor in the knightly sense, no metal, no polish, no grandeur, but armor made of wool, leather, and stubbornness. The kind that itched, sagged, and smelled, but that stood between your skin and the night air. Medieval peasants did not have wardrobes. They had clothes singular. Often just one set, perhaps two if fortune smiled. And so clothing was not changed. It was layered, patched, and relayered. Tunics made of coarse wool, breeches tied at the knee. Cloaks thick with lanolin, heavy with smoke. Every thread worn until it unraveled, then rewoven if it could be salvaged. Washing clothes in winter was rare. It required water, which might be frozen. It required drying, which might take days. So peasants wore what they had over and over until the cloth grew stiff with sweat and ash. Smell was not shameful, it was survival. Cleanliness was not a virtue, it was a luxury. Underwear, if it existed at all, was simple linen, a fabric hard to produce and harder to keep clean. It absorbed sweat and filth and was often the first to fray. Socks were rare. Feet were wrapped in cloth or left bare inside rough leather shoes. There were no right or left shoes, just shoes. Made by hand, passed down if still usable, worn until soles gave in. And with clothes came company. Not people, though they huddled together too, but parasites, fleas, lice, mites. In the warmth of layered tunics and the seams of cloaks they thrived. Itching was constant, scratching a communal pastime. Children learned early to pick through each other's hair, searching for the tiny invaders. Adults scratched without apology. It was simply part of life. Bathing in the modern sense was almost unknown in winter. Water was too cold, too scarce, too precious. A washcloth dipped in near-freezing water might be passed over the face and underarms, but full immersion was rare. And even then, it could be dangerous. Illness did not come from germs people didn't yet know about, bacteria, but from chill, from imbalance, from wet skin left exposed to wind. The itch, like the cold, became part of one's identity. You did not rid yourself of lice. You lived with them. You muttered about them. You learned to avoid scratching too obviously at church. But you did not waste energy pretending they weren't there. There were remedies, of course. Folk cures passed down through generations. Ash rubbed into the scalp. Vinegar wiped onto sleeves. Wormwood boiled and used to rinse bedding, but none of it truly worked. It merely made the insects uncomfortable enough to buy a few hours of peace. And so warmth became a trade-off. The more layers you wore, the more fleas you sheltered. The closer you slept to others, the more lice moved between you. Even livestock brought their own critters, and when pigs shared your floorboards, you welcomed the heat but inherited the fleas. Blankets were rare, and those that existed were thick, woven from scratchy wool and often shared. One blanket might cover 3 people. It was not about comfort, it was about containment. To hold in body heat, to trap it like a candle under glass. Some peasants used straw stuffed into sacks as padding. Others lay on loose straw, directly changed rarely. The straw absorbed sweat, spilled broth, and more, and eventually it teemed with life. Insects, mold, mice if you were unlucky. Still, it was warmer than the bare earth. Hygiene in the modern sense did not exist. There was no soap as we know it, only rough lye concoctions made with ash and animal fat. These burned the skin if used too often, so they were used sparingly, perhaps only on laundry days, which in winter might not come at all. To be a peasant in winter was to be layered in discomfort, but not defeated by it. There was a strange resilience in it all, a shrugging acceptance that life was not clean, not fragrant, not soft. And yet they found ways to manage. A hot stone wrapped in cloth might be pressed to the feet before bed. A fur cap, if one could be bartered or made, might be worn indoors even during sleep. The family cat might curl at the base of the bed, not as a pet, but as a source of warmth and pest control. Even laughter, strangely, was warmth. Jokes told in the dark. Quiet mockery of the lice who ruled them. A shared scratch between siblings. Humor was heat. It made the long nights pass a little faster. So when you pull up your soft fleece blanket tonight, itch-free and freshly bathed, consider this. Your ancestors, or those who lived like them, endured winter not in spite of discomfort, but through it. The itch was part of the ritual, the scratch a lullaby. And sleep, when it came, was not from peace, but from exhaustion. Wrapped in wool, surrounded by family, and buzzing with the quiet presence of 1,000 unseen companions. And still, they slept. Winter did not isolate just the body, it also quieted the mind. For medieval peasants, days grew shorter, and nights stretched long and cold, not just in temperature, but in sound. The world shrank. Fields once teeming with work and motion were now blanketed with snow, and the roads between villages became uncertain. For many, the boundaries of winter life extended no farther than a stone's throw from their own door. In the center of every medieval village stood the church, a modest building, sometimes of wood, sometimes of stone. Its spire or simple cross pointed toward heaven not as an aspiration, but as a constant, a marker against the gray sky. The church was the one place that did not slow in winter. If anything, it became more central. For peasants, it offered something that few other places could structure. The bells still rang, not always on time, but often enough to remind you that the world was still moving. Masses were held more frequently. Feast days, saints' days, fast days. Each brought a kind of rhythm that helped mark the endless blur of winter. Even if food was scarce, even if your breath curled in the cold nave as you knelt, you were not alone. The priest was often the only person in the village who could read. His Latin was a language of ritual, not understanding. Most peasants didn't comprehend the words, but they knew the shape of them, the cadence of prayer, the soft drone of chants in cold stone spaces. It was comfort, not because it explained anything, but because it was predictable. The church also served as keeper of warmth. Not literal warmth, for it was no cozier than the homes of the villagers, but a place where bodies gathered. The collective presence of dozens of people brought a kind of human insulation. Cloaks brushed together, knees touched. Children slept in laps while sermons drifted overhead. The sense of belonging, of being seen even in hardship, was enough to endure another week. Beyond the spiritual, the church was where news traveled of births, deaths, illnesses, or the rare arrival of someone from another place. A traveler, a monk, a merchant. Such visits were uncommon in winter, but when they happened, the entire village seemed to breathe differently. There was life beyond the trees, beyond the snow, beyond the silence, and silence was abundant. In summer, villages hummed with sounds animals work, laughter tools, clinking wagons, creaking, but winter hushed them all. Even animals grew quieter. Chickens huddled silently. Pigs grunted less. Cows rumbled low, if at all. The snow absorbed sound like a great blanket, muffling every movement. Inside, homes' voices fell too. Speech was slow, conversations short. There was little to say that wasn't already known. Is the fire still going? How much grain is left? Is the baby warm enough? The rest, thoughts, worries, dreams, stayed silent. But silence did not mean peace. It meant reflection. It meant noticing things you'd rather not. The way the fire leaned too low, the ache in your father's hands, the cough that didn't stop. In summer, distractions abounded. In winter, there was only thought. And yet in the hush, something sacred grew. A kind of patience. The kind that could not be taught, only endured. When days pass slowly, when warmth must be rationed, when food is uncertain, you learn to sit still not from discipline, but from necessity. Children were told stories, often the same ones night after night, about saints or sinners or wolves in the woods. Sometimes about great kings, though such tales felt far removed from muddy boots and leaking roofs. More often, stories were warnings disguised as wonder. Don't go into the woods at night. Always bless your bread. The first snow means the ground spirits are awake. Superstition filled the cracks where understanding failed. A cracked window could mean illness. A broken egg in winter might be seen as an omen. Shadows moving too quickly across the floor. Perhaps a restless ancestor. And so homes were guarded not just with wood and fire, but with ritual. Sprigs of evergreen above the door. A prayer said over the hearth. Bread marked with a cross before slicing. These habits were not questioned. They were inherited. Passed down with the same certainty as a worn cloak or a chipped bowl. They gave weight to actions that might otherwise feel meaningless. They turned routine into reassurance. For the medieval peasant, winter was not just a physical trial. It was emotional, spiritual. The silence was heavy, yes, but also full. Full of thought, full of stories, full of waiting. Waiting not just for warmth, but for light. Not just for spring, but for something to change. And so the church bells rang. And so the snow fell. And so people endured. Not loudly, not heroically, but steadily, quietly, together. In the modern world, homes are defined by their boundaries. Bedrooms are for sleeping. Kitchens are for cooking. Barns are for animals. But in the medieval peasant's world, such distinctions were neither practical nor necessary. A home was not a place of privacy or of order. It was a shelter. And in the coldest nights, that shelter had to serve everyone, human and animal alike. Most peasant homes were one-room structures. Small, low-ceilinged, with walls made of wattle and daub, a mixture of twigs, mud, and straw. The roof might be thatch packed as tightly as hands could manage, but always vulnerable to leaks, wind, and snow. There were no internal walls, no insulation, no bedrooms. In that single space, families slept, cooked, talked, prayed, and survived. And as winter deepened, animals joined them not in stables or pens, but within the same four walls. This was not sentimentality. Peasants did not cuddle pigs out of affection. They brought animals inside for warmth. A cow's body heat could rival a small fire. A pig gave off more warmth than a thick blanket. Chickens, tucked into corners, added a few precious degrees to the ambient air. And the more bodies in the room, the less heat escaped. So the house became a shared dwelling. Humans in one part, animals in another, though there were no real partitions. Perhaps a wooden fence to keep larger animals from stepping on children. Perhaps straw laid down to catch manure. But the smells were shared. The noises too. A sudden snort in the dark. A cluck. A rustle. And yes, sometimes a mess. This was life. It was not considered dirty, or rather dirt was the default, not the exception. Everyone was equally smudged. No one judged. In a place where smoke curled endlessly from the hearth and mud clung to every boot, a little more mess hardly mattered. In fact, the presence of animals was sometimes reassuring. Their sounds meant they were alive. And if they were alive, then the family had meat. Someday. Or milk. Or eggs. The animals were not pets, but they were not strangers either. They were companions in the shared ritual of getting through winter. Children learned to sleep through the grunts of pigs and the shifting hooves of cows. Babies were rocked not just by their mothers, but by the quiet rhythm of the animals breathing nearby. And though it might seem strange now, there was a kind of harmony in the shared space, a rhythm of warmth, motion, and life. Of course there were risks. Animals brought parasites, filth, even disease. But the risk of freezing was greater. And so the choice was made again and again, year after year. Share the space, share the breath, survive together. In wealthier villages, some homes were designed with byres spaces built slightly lower than the human area where animals could stay. The heat from their bodies would rise naturally into the living space. But for most peasants, such architectural thought was a luxury. Instead, they adapted. They made room. They cleared corners. They laid straw, and they slept side by side with the animals who would feed them come spring. It wasn't always peaceful. Roosters crowed at odd hours, pigs rolled in their sleep, chickens fluttered without warning. But these were the sounds of life. They were far better than the silence of an empty room. In this way, the medieval peasant home became a kind of living system, not clean, not quiet, but functional. Each breath mattered. Each body gave warmth. Each creature had a role. And beyond the practical, there was a strange intimacy to it all. To share space with a cow, to sleep within earshot of its low, steady breath, was to remember that survival was communal. That warmth was not just a luxury, but a group effort. The walls might be thin. The wind might slip through every crack, but inside there was life. Flickering, shuffling, snorting, scratching, life in all its messy, noisy, imperfect forms. And that life, no matter how humble, was enough to make it to morning. So when you wake in your warm room with only the hum of your heater and the silence of sealed windows, take a moment to imagine a world where warmth came not from technology, but from proximity. Where breath was shared not just between humans, but with every living being you depended on. A world where the cold was kept at bay, not by central heating, but by the simple decision to stay close. In the long quiet of winter, when the ground was frozen and the nights never seemed to end, it was not the strongest arms that held the village together. It was the busiest hands. And often those hands belonged to women. For medieval peasant women, there was no rest season. Summer was filled with fields and harvest. Autumn brought slaughtering and storage. But winter, though slower, demanded a kind of constant care that was just as exhausting. When the men were idle from the fields, when the livestock huddled inside, it was women who kept everything from collapsing. Before sunrise, she was already awake, stirring the embers in the hearth, blowing, gently coaxing a bit of life into the coals, adding dried twigs or hay, hoping for a flame. Fire was not just warmth, it was breakfast, it was boiling water, it was protection. Without it, the entire house would freeze. Next came food. There was little left by midwinter. Maybe some stale barley, a root vegetable going soft, some dried beans. But with time and skill it became soup. Always soup. A thin, bubbling broth that could be stretched over days. With each serving less flavor, but still enough to fill a belly. Bread was rationed. The loaves were hard now, having gone stale weeks ago. But they could be soaked in broth, made into gruel, or crumbled and fried with lard, if any was left. A peasant woman knew every trick, not to impress, not to delight, but to sustain. Clothes were mended by hand endlessly. A tunic torn at the sleeve. A child's hood unraveling. A cloak whose corner had burned near the fire. There were no sewing kits, no pins, no machines. Just a bone needle, a bit of linen thread, and patience. And spinning never stopped. Even in winter, wool had to be cleaned, carded, spun into yarn. If you waited until spring, there would be nothing ready to knit or weave. So women sat near the fire, spindle in hand, fingers numb but moving, a rhythm older than memory. The children needed tending, always. In illness, in a boredom, in hunger. A baby might cry from cold or colic or nothing at all. A mother's arms were the only medicine. A lullaby hummed under her breath. A bit of cloth warmed near the fire and wrapped gently across a tiny chest. Older children helped when they could. Fetching water from the nearest stream, now half frozen, treacherous. Feeding the animals, collecting kindling. But even they knew if the home stayed warm, if the soup pot stayed full, it was because of the women. Sometimes a grandmother shared the load. Bent with age, wrapped in every wool she owned, but still sharp of mind. She might tell stories, the kind that carried warnings. Don't leave the hearth unattended. Never let the last log burn. Don't whistle at night. Whether they were superstition or memory didn't matter. They were law. Women also watched for illness. A cough that lingered. A child that wouldn't eat, a husband who grew too still. With no doctors, no medicine, it was observation that saved lives. A poultice here, a herbal tea there, a prayer whispered over a damp brow. And when death came, as it often did in winter, it was women who prepared the body. Washed it, wrapped it, wept over it, quietly, quickly, sometimes burying it before the ground was too frozen to dig. All of this was done not in silence, but without complaint. There was no time for despair, no reward for exhaustion. A woman's worth was proven not through ceremony, but through repetition, through keeping the fire lit day after day, even when her hands bled. Men had strength, but women had endurance. And it was endurance that winter demanded. There was a little privacy, no separate space to retreat to, no door to close. But women found moments for themselves, a whispered prayer while kneading dough, a breath of stillness while spinning wool, a glance out the single window at the falling snow. Their names were rarely recorded, their words rarely written, but they were the hearth keepers, the thread spinners, the ones who turned cold into comfort, hunger into nourishment, emptiness into survival. Even the church recognized their place, albeit quietly. Saints like Bridget were honored in rural villages. Not queens, not martyrs, but women who cooked, healed, protected. Their relics were bits of cloth bred fire, things peasant women touched daily. And when spring came, when the ice thawed and the roads cleared, it was the women who emerged weary but ready. They had kept the home alive, not through force, not through pride, but through the gentle, persistent work of care. So as you rest tonight, perhaps, beneath blankets sewn by machine with soup that took 10 minutes instead of 10 hours, consider the weight that once rested on a mother's shoulders, and how without fanfare or thanks, she bore it, again and again. Winter in the medieval world was not just a season of hunger and cold, it was a season of mystery, of shadows, of superstition. And for the medieval peasant, long nights and howling winds didn't just stir the body, they stirred the imagination. When the sun disappeared by mid-afternoon, when the fire cast strange shapes across the walls, and when the forests beyond the village turned black and silent, the world began to feel thinner, like something unseen might be just on the other side of the dark. Religion was present, of course. The church taught of saints, of angels, of the afterlife. But daily life, especially in the countryside, was still filled with old beliefs, older than Latin, older than the priest. And winter made those beliefs feel closer. Children were warned not to go outside after sunset, not just because of wolves or thieves, but because of spirits. The wild hunt, some called it a ghostly procession of riders in the sky passing in a flurry of wind and snow. If you heard them, you must hide. If you saw them, pray, and never whistle. Whistling at night might invite them closer. Others spoke of witches, not the ones from trial records or fairy tales, but the quiet kind. The old woman who lived at the edge of the woods, the one with the cat, the one who gathered herbs at odd hours. Maybe she healed a cough, maybe she caused one. Frost itself was a spirit. Jack Frost, as later tales would name him, was known by other names. Then the ice one, the night toucher, the window scratcher. If your breath hung too long in the air, some said he might catch it. If you didn't cross yourself before bed, he might slip in through the cracks. To protect the home, people hung charms. A bunch of dried herbs above the door, a piece of iron near the threshold. In some places, bread was buried near the hearth to feed whatever might wander near. Not because they were sure these things worked, but because, what if they did? Dreams were taken seriously, too. A dream of teeth falling out meant illness. A dream of snow in the bed meant death nearby. People spoke of dreams in the morning as if decoding messages from another world. The cold, it seemed, was not just weather. It was a presence, a test, a haunting. And so the nights were filled with small rituals, a cross traced on the window pane with a wet thumb, a whisper over the last coal before sleep, a lullaby that doubled as a prayer. Even fire had rules. You never left it completely unattended. You never let it die entirely, not just for warmth, but because a cold hearth was considered unlucky. Some said spirits lingered in cold ashes. Others said a dead fire was an invitation for illness. And illness itself was mysterious. A sudden cough, a child too quiet, a man who couldn't stand all were explained not with germs, but with imbalance. Bad air, bad dreams, a glance from someone with a jealous heart. They called it the evil eye. A look so sharp it could wilt crops, sour milk, or sicken a baby. To protect against it, mothers would tie red threads around a child's wrist. A simple loop, a silent shield. Sometimes old women told stories of shapeshifters, humans who could become wolves. Not werewolves, not exactly, but beings who blurred the line between man and beast. They roamed the woods at night, some to protect, others to prey. The forest was a place of both fear and fascination. It gave wood and food, but it also held the unknown. People believed trees could listen, that some groves were sacred, that to cut the wrong branch without asking could bring misfortune. And so, even when desperate for firewood, peasants would leave small offerings, a coin, a piece of bread, a whispered thank you. Children were taught early to respect the invisible, to say, bless you, not just after sneezing, but after laughter. Joy could attract envy. Envy could invite curses. But amid all this belief was not fear. It was structure. It gave meaning to suffering. If a chicken died unexpectedly, if the roof collapsed, if a child was born weak, there was a reason. A lesson. A spirit not honored, a rule not followed, and that reason gave comfort. Because to accept suffering as random as meaningless was far worse. In some villages, winter festivals helped push back the darkness. Fires were lit, songs sung, bread shared, not out of abundance, but defiance. Light against dark, community against the unknown. These festivals blended Christian and pagan. A blessing of the animals one day, a procession with torches the next. A prayer for spring, followed by a superstition about snow. The priest might frown, but he rarely stopped them, because he too lived in the dark. He too heard the wind and wondered. And when all was said and done, when the fire dimmed and the final log turned to ash, people lay down, not in fear, but in hope. Hope that the night would pass, that the rules had been followed, that the old spirits had been respected, that the cold would not claim one more soul. Winter was still, but it was not idle. For medieval peasants, the cold months were not just for surviving, they were for preparing. Not with ambition, but with necessity. Summer would return, the soil would need turning, the animals would need tending, and everything would break again. So in the hush of winter, when the fields lay frozen and the world narrowed to a single smoky room, people turned inward, to their homes, their tools, their hands. The peasant's home was not just a shelter, it was a workshop. In one corner, a pile of broken tools waited. A hoe with a split handle, a scythe dulled from too many harvests. Wooden forks, cracked buckets, a missing wheel spoke, all waiting patiently. Winter gave time, but not ease. There were no hardware stores, no deliveries. If something broke, it stayed broken unless someone could fix it. And usually that someone lived under the same roof. Fathers taught sons how to carve new handles. Mothers taught daughters how to weave new baskets. Older siblings passed down tricks learned not from books, but from repetition. Never sharpen a blade when the metal is too cold. Always soak the wood before bending it. These lessons were not written, they were etched in habit. The tools were few but valued. An iron knife, a wooden mallet, a pair of bone shears. They were kept in leather rolls or wrapped in cloth or simply tucked beneath a sleeping mat. Sharpening stones were shared. Rope was coiled, re-knotted, reused. Repair was a ritual, a slow, methodical act. It gave purpose to long hours. A dull knife might take a whole evening to sharpen. A cracked bowl might be stitched with wire. Even shoes' leather stiffened from mud and snow were soaked, reshaped, and patched with whatever was available. Children helped in small ways, holding a piece of wood while a parent carved, sorting nails if any remained, untangling bits of cord. Their fingers were small and sometimes more precise than adult hands. Textiles, too, were mended. Cloaks worn thin near the edges, mittens unraveling, wool socks too full of holes to warm anything. Women spun thread slowly, rhythmically. Needles passed from hand to hand, threading not just cloth, but memory. The hearth became the center of everything. Its light flickered over every task. Its warmth kept fingers nimble. Ash drifted into every crevice, but no one minded. It was just part of the air. Even animals needed care. Hooves were trimmed, harnesses patched, a yoke mended. The barn door repaired before spring's wind could tear it off. A cracked water bucket might be lined with pitch if any could be found. None of it was glamorous, but it was real. A kind of quiet industry that kept the peasant world from crumbling. Every stitch delayed a disaster. Every sharpened blade meant one less worry in the field. There was also preparation. New tools if time allowed. A spare handle for the rake. A new spindle carved slowly over weeks. Some even whittled toys, not because they had time to waste, but because children needed small joys too. Music found its place in these moments. A low humming, a carved flute, a simple string instrument made from gut and wood. Not concertos, just tunes, repetitive soft, to pass the time, to lighten the work, to remember that life had more than labor. And stories, always stories, told between tasks, while patching a roof tile, while shaping a wheel. Tales of past winters, of strange creatures, of brave ancestors. Some were true, some weren't. It didn't matter. They filled the air. Tools were never owned casually. Every item had a story. This knife was my father's. This hammer was made from a piece of storm-fallen oak. They were not just instruments, they were extensions of hands of lineage. Sometimes tools were borrowed. A village might have only one awl or one proper chisel, and so they were passed with care, with thanks, and returned, oiled, and wrapped. Community was not just shared food, it was shared ability. Even when snow buried the fields, even when the roads disappeared, work continued. It slowed, softened, shifted, but never stopped. Because winter was not just about surviving the cold. It was about making sure you were ready when the thaw came. And so, in the glow of a tired fire surrounded by creaking beams and the quiet breath of animals, peasants worked, not loudly, not quickly, but with purpose. And while the wind whispered through the thatch above, they sharpened their scythes and waited. Winter has a way of making things louder, not in sound, but in feeling. The long nights, the gray skies, the slow ticking of days that seem to fold into one another. For the medieval peasant, winter was not just cold or tiring, it was profoundly quiet, and in that quiet loneliness could grow. Life in a medieval village was close-knit. Homes were small, families shared space, but physical closeness did not always protect against emotional distance. There were times, especially in the coldest months, when it felt like the whole world had gone still and you were the only one awake inside it. Loneliness crept in slowly. It wasn't dramatic. It was the silence between conversations, the empty pause after a story ended, the moment after the last ember died in the hearth. It was when the howling wind outside reminded you that you were very, very small, and the night was very, very long. Peasants did not speak often of emotions, not because they didn't feel them, but because words were rationed like food. You saved them for when they were needed. You expressed more with action, a pot refilled before being asked, a shawl draped over a sleeping child, a shared crust of bread. But in winter, even gestures grew thin. People retreated inward, huddled under cloaks, closed their eyes longer, not to sleep but to disappear for a while. And so they sang, not loudly, not joyfully, but softly, slowly. Simple lullabies passed down from generations, words that didn't always rhyme, melodies that changed with each retelling. Mothers sang to babies, grandmothers hummed to no one at all, and sometimes the whole house listened. Lullabies weren't only for children, they were for the fire, for the walls, for the wind. They reminded the listener and the singer that the cold would not last forever. That morning would come, that they were not alone. Some songs told of saints who brought spring. Others were nonsense verses meant to distract hungry minds. A few were laments for lost children, lost harvests, lost warmth. But all shared the same tempo, gentle, repetitive, predictable. There was comfort in repetition, in hearing the same tune night after night, in knowing the next note before it arrived. In winter, that kind of certainty was rare and precious. Even the animals learned the rhythm. A pig might settle into straw at the first note. A cow might stop shifting its hooves. The sound of a voice steady low was as calming as heat, and time passed like this. Not by clock or calendar, but by habit. Wake, tend the fire, eat, mend, sing, sleep, repeat. The sameness dulled the pain, but it also dulled the joy. Days bled into nights, weeks disappeared, and when you looked back, it felt like you had lived in the same hour for months. Yet within that hour, tiny changes mattered. A child's cough easing, a patch of blue sky, a crust of ice that melted just a bit sooner than yesterday. These small signs were celebrated not with shouts, but with nods, with quiet satisfaction. Time was felt differently then. It wasn't scheduled or tracked, it was observed. It's been 2 moons since the river froze. The birds have returned to the tree outside. The frost didn't reach the hearth last night. Time was marked in nature, in weather, in the body's aches and the fire's hunger. Old people watched the sky for hints. They felt the wind, listened to it, not as poetry but as information. A southern breeze meant something, a pale sun meant something else. The world spoke slowly. You just had to learn how to hear it. Children sometimes asked, "When will it be warm again?" And the answer was rarely a date. It was a story. When the first crocus blooms, when the chickens begin to lay again, when the fox's fur starts to thin. So much of winter was waiting, but not passive waiting, active. A holding pattern full of chores and checks and whispers and songs. A kind of survival dance danced over and over in slow, careful steps. And when sleep finally came, it wasn't always deep. Dreams wandered, some peaceful, some strange. The sound of the fire cracking, the creak of a roof beam, the shift of a pig in the straw, all became part of the dream. But still, they slept. Not because they were warm, not because they were safe, but because they were tired. And because in sleep the night passed faster. And when the morning came, dim gray unchanged, they rose again and sang again. Sleep in the medieval winter was not an escape. It was a negotiation. No one simply lay down and drifted off. There was too much to consider, too much to arrange. Before you could close your eyes, you had to build your nest. Every blanket, every scrap of cloth, every clump of straw mattered. First came the base straw laid out over the hard dirt floor. It offered no softness, only separation from the biting cold below. Over that, a layer of rough wool. Then came the human layers. Children in the middle, elders along the sides. The strongest, usually the parents near the edge closest to the hearth. Everyone packed tight, shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, not for affection, but for insulation. This was known as the family pile, and in winter, it was more sacred than any altar. There was no changing into pajamas. What you wore during the day was what you slept in. You might loosen a belt or untie your boots, but even that was risky. Removing shoes meant exposing toes, and frostbite never needed an invitation. Sometimes people even slept sitting up, with their backs against the wall, with their arms crossed, cloaks wrapped tightly around them like a cocoon. It wasn't comfort they sought, just stillness. A pause from the cold. Dreams came in flickers. Not long narratives, but flashes, a field in spring, a loaf of bread, a warm bath remembered. They would vanish quickly, chased away by a sudden draft, a cough nearby, or the soft moo of a cow shifting its weight. And yet the ritual of sleep persisted. Before bed, the fire was banked. Not put out, that would have been foolish, but buried under ash, carefully preserved, so it could be revived in the morning. A whispered prayer might follow, a gesture of the cross, a blessing for the house. Then came silence. Not total silence, the fire still hissed. The animals breathed a child, might murmur in their sleep, but a hush that settled over the house like snow on a roof. Heavy, protective. And as the night wore on, sleep came in layers like everything else. A bit at a time. First the feet went numb, then the legs stopped twitching, then finally the mind let go. No one slept deeply. No one slept long, but they slept enough. Enough to face the next day, enough to tend the fire, enough to whisper, "We're still here." And in the dark, that was everything. In the heart of a medieval winter night, survival often meant turning your entire world into a carefully layered defense against the cold. Every item had a purpose, every scrap of wool, every stone in the hearth, even the dirt underfoot. But there was another powerful layer between life and frost, the shared wisdom passed from one generation to the next. In households where words carried as much weight as firewood, old stories weren't just for comfort, they were instruction manuals dressed as fables. Grandparents too frail to carry logs or patch roofs shared lessons in whispers and anecdotes. A grandmother might tell how moss stuffed into a drafty wall once saved her sister from frostbite. A father might recite a rhyme that reminded his children to check the hearth coals before sleep. Through repetition, through rhythm, survival knowledge was encoded in memory. This wasn't idle chatter. It was oral engineering born of experience and reinforced each winter like a sacred chant. Even lullabies changed during these months. Instead of soft songs about summer fields, they spoke of embers and ash, of patience and breath. Sleep warm, sleep deep, they'd say the fire sleeps too. And indeed it did. The fire didn't just heat the home, it listened, it waited. It was a quiet participant in the rhythms of life. And in the stillness between the gusts of wind, the creak of timber, and the occasional snort from a slumbering cow, there was space for reflection. A moment to remember that winters had come before and been endured. Each cold night survived was another page written in a long book of resilience. The fire might flicker, the wind might wail, but the knowledge, the stories burned bright within each heart. When the cold bites hard enough to keep you awake at night, medieval peasants had a solution. Don't even try to pretend everyone's sleeping at once. Instead, they developed a survival strategy that today would make any military commander proud, sleeping in shifts. It wasn't some grand, organized system with whistles and roll calls. It was far simpler and much more desperate. Half the household stayed awake tending to the fire and patching up stray drafts, while the other half curled up under threadbare blankets and hay, trying to catch a few precious hours of half-frozen sleep. The fire needed constant attention. Left alone, it would die down, and restarting it, remember, was about as easy as getting a stubborn donkey to dance. So someone had to be on ember patrol, since no one wanted to get up once they were finally warmish families rotated shifts. You dozed for a few hours, got elbowed awake, then stumbled over to the hearth to poke, prod, and curse the fire back to life while trying not to step on a goat. The rotation wasn't glamorous. There were no night vision goggles, no late-night snacks, and certainly no 5 more minutes snooze buttons. Just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a growing resentment toward whoever snored loudest during your shift. Children old enough to hold a stick were pressed into service, learning early that in winter everyone pulled their weight or froze trying. Grandparents sometimes stayed by the fire longer, both because of their experience and frankly because arthritis made lying down and getting up again a monumental event. And when it was your turn to sleep, good luck. With people moving about, animals rustling, wind battering the walls, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who accidentally rolled over too hard, getting quality rest was a miracle. Yet despite the exhaustion, the system worked. Sleeping in shifts meant that there was always a set of eyes and cold, begrudging hands ready to keep the hearth alive. The embers survived, and by extension, so did the family. So next time you grumble about waking up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant squinting into a smoking fires at 300 a.m., wondering if toes were really that important after all. You know it's cold when you have to think about how you breathe just to stay alive. For medieval peasants, during the dead of winter, even exhaling could be a calculation. You didn't want to let out too much warmth. You didn't want to inhale too deeply and let the icy air carve itself into your chest. So people breathed slowly, intentionally, through woolen scarves if they had them, through their sleeves if they didn't. They would curl up and bury their faces into the crooks of their arms, or hide behind a cloak that smelled of smoke and old rain, trying to make a little pocket of their own warmth. Children were taught to breathe like the oxen, slow, strong, steady. Not because it helped the lungs exactly, but because it conserved energy. In the still dark, every small action mattered. At night, under layers of coarse wool, straw animal hide, and whatever else could be draped across the human form, families shared breath. You could feel it, the rhythm of your sister's lungs beside you, the soft puffs of your father near the fire, the faint steam of the cow across the room. The house became a chest, and everyone breathed inside it. Sometimes your breath froze, not in some poetic way, but literally. Moisture from your exhale would collect on the edge of your blanket or tunic, only to frost over by morning. People would wake up with tiny icicles in their beards, stiff corners on their cloaks, and that odd metallic feeling in their nostrils that meant the air was so cold it didn't even seem to move. Waking up took effort. There were no alarms, only the hiss of a dying ember, the mutter of a stirring goat, the shiver that ran down your spine before your eyes even opened. The body resisted. Bones stiff, fingers reluctant. To emerge from warmth, even barely enough warmth, into the open air of the room felt like punishment. And still, they moved. First, check the fire. Was there any glow? Could it be coaxed back? Then, the pot. Was the water frozen solid, or was there a trickle of warmth left? Then the animals. Were they still alive? Breathing, shivering. Then the room. Always the room. Were the walls holding? Had snow pushed in through the thatch? Had wind unseated something in the roof? There was no rushing in these moments, only steady steps, slow breath, controlled movements. Because fast meant careless, and careless meant breaking things or freezing worse. Even conversation was subdued in the early morning cold. Words felt heavy. Breath turned every syllable into a ghost in the air, dancing in pale curls. You spoke only what needed saying, still glowing. Fetch more wood. She's coughing again. Eggs frozen. That last one stung more than most. The quiet routine of breath and movement kept people grounded. The predictability was its own kind of prayer. And though the body ached and the air bit and the day ahead held only more of the same, the breath continued, steady, foggy, fragile. By the time winter had settled into its deepest cold, the peasant's hands told the whole story. Cracked at the knuckles, red and raw around the fingertips, stiff, slow, and brittle like old leather left in the wind. The work of survival didn't wait for fair weather, and it certainly didn't wait for your skin to stop bleeding. There were no gloves, not for most. Perhaps some wool wraps, if there was enough spun thread and time to shape them. Otherwise, hands were tucked into armpits, pressed between thighs, wrapped in corners of cloaks still damp with yesterday's melted frost. It was awkward, it was uncomfortable, but it was warmth. Tasks that once felt simple, tying a knot, lifting a bucket, smoothing dough, became challenges when the fingers wouldn't obey. And yet they carried on, because to delay meant to lose what little heat the hearth offered, and to lose that was not an option. But cold hands weren't the only ache. By midwinter, bellies had grown quieter. There was food, just not much of it. The salted meat had grown hard. The grains had to be rationed. The root vegetables had grown soft or blackened. Every bite was considered. Every crumb swept into a pot turned into a porridge or thin stew or mash. Eating was not just for nourishment, it was for comfort. The warmth of a wooden bowl in your hand, the steam rising and brushing your cheeks, it reminded you that not everything was frozen. Not yet. Children were taught early not to ask for seconds. Not because their parents were cruel, but because there were no seconds to offer. Hunger was a shared understanding. An invisible guest in every home, sitting quietly by the door. Still, meals were ritualized. Bread was broken slowly. Bowls were passed in order, elder first, child last. A brief prayer or murmur before eating. Not always religious, but always reverent, as if acknowledging the sheer effort it took to bring even this modest food to the table. And somehow, amid the hunger and the cold, and the endless days that blurred into each other, there remained hope. It was quiet, faint, but it glowed beneath the surface like the last ember in a hearth. Hope came in tiny forms, the sound of snow dripping from the roof, the sight of a raven returning to the woods. The first day the water bucket didn't freeze solid. The moment you caught a whiff of earth instead of ash. Spring was nowhere to be seen, but it whispered from beneath the frost. In the curls of smoke that didn't blow sideways. In the weight of your cloak that somehow felt a little less wet. In the stories that started to mention planting instead of only surviving. Some peasants marked walls with charcoal to track the days. Some counted candle stubs. Some tied knots in string or scratched tallies into beams. These were not calendars, they were reminders. Proof that time was moving, that they were not stuck. And when the hunger bit deepest, they reminded each other. Remember last year, we made it through. Just a little longer. It wasn't always true. Not everyone made it, but the saying of it mattered. Because warmth is not just in fire. And fullness is not just in food. Sometimes warmth is in words, in memory. In the soft promise that winter, no matter how long, no matter how cruel, would end. And so the cracked hands continued. The quiet meals were shared. The breaths curled in the air like smoke signals. And beneath it all, like a faint drumbeat, hope kept them warm. Some nights in the medieval winter passed quietly. The fire glowed soft. The animals were still. The breath of sleeping children rose and fell in the dark like a song forgotten. But then there were the other nights, the ones where the wind decided to speak. It would begin softly, a hiss slipping through the thatch like someone testing the edges of your walls. Then it would build, rising, howling, pressing against the door as if something on the other side wanted in. The kind of wind that didn't just pass through, but looked for openings, and the house would answer. Every board creaked, every beam groaned. The roof, a patchwork of thatch and hope, rustled like dry leaves, and for a moment it felt as though the entire house might lift and drift away. You couldn't fight this wind. You endured it, curled deeper, pressed against the wall, closed your eyes and reminded yourself that it had blown like this last winter. And the house had held, mostly. Sometimes the roof would leak. Snow melt would find its way through and drip slow, patient cold onto your blanket, your cheek, your food. Buckets would be placed, cloaks moved, straw rearranged. No one complained. The wind didn't care about your curses. And still, the roof stayed. Not because it was strong, but because someone had patched it. In summer, in fall, with reeds, with branches, with pieces of old cloth. You remembered those hours spent sweating beneath the sun, tying knots with aching hands, thinking, I hope this holds in January. Now was January, and it was holding. Sometimes the wind brought more than noise. It brought memories. People spoke of nights when the wind had taken someone, a traveler too slow, a baby too young, an elder too proud to come in from the shed. The wind, they said, knew your name. So doors were bolted tight, gaps stuffed with straw, crosses drawn in ash above the lintel, just in case. And still the wind found its way, not to harm, but to remind that no war was perfect, that no life was guaranteed, that survival was not strength alone, but ritual and respect. The next morning, if the roof had held and the door still shut and the fire still smoldered, it was enough. A small miracle wrapped in frost. You stepped outside, perhaps into a world shaped by the wind. Drifts of snow curled around corners. Footprints vanished. Trees bowed low as if remembering something heavy. The silence after a windstorm was not peace. It was reverence. The villagers would speak of it in short phrases. "Did you hear it last night? Sounded like it wanted in. Roof's still there. Thank God." And they would go on. Feed the animals, stoke the hearth, repack the straw where it had shifted. Life resumed slowly without ceremony, but deeply aware of what had passed. Because when the wind speaks, you listen. And when your roof listens back, you live. Winter did not only bring cold. It brought illness, quiet, creeping, and relentless. In a medieval peasant household, sickness in winter was not unusual. In fact, it was expected. The cold weakened the body. The smoke from the hearth irritated the lungs. The close quarters meant that once one person coughed, everyone would cough soon after. There was no such thing as isolation. There were no spare rooms, no clean hospitals. If someone grew ill, they remained right there beside the fire, in the family bed, under the same blanket everyone shared. The symptoms were familiar: a rattle in the chest, a burn in the throat, a fever so strong it made the cold feel welcome. Sometimes the illness passed, sometimes it didn't, and the people around the sick simply cared. There were no doctors in the village. Not usually. A midwife might offer remedies. An older neighbor might come with herbs, dried yarrow for fevers, sage for the throat, garlic if there was any left. Broth was made thin-hot and often. Water was warmed. Hands were held. No one expected miracles. They expected effort. Quiet, steady effort. A mother would sleep upright with a coughing child against her chest. A father would rise early to boil water again and again. Siblings would sit close, not because they didn't fear the illness, but because distance didn't exist in such a space. You shared everything, even that. Sometimes prayers were whispered, not for healing, but for mercy. And sometimes the sick recovered. They would wake in the night and ask for water. They would cough less the next day. They would rise by the end of the week and tend the fire again. And sometimes they didn't. When death came in winter, it was quieter than in any other season. The body didn't rot quickly. It simply stopped, covered in wool. Eyes closed, hands still warm. The family didn't scream. They murmured. They wrapped the body gently as they had wrapped it for sleep the night before. There were rituals even in grief. The window might be open just for a moment to let the soul pass. A candle might be lit even if fat was scarce. Bread might be broken in silence. Not because there was an appetite, but because eating was the only way forward. If the ground wasn't frozen, the dead could be buried quickly in the small churchyard or family plot. If the earth was too hard, the body might be kept respectfully, carefully until thaw. Covered in cloth, protected from animals, prayed over each day. And then, life resumed, because it had to. Because there were other children, other fires, other mornings that needed surviving. Grief in the medieval winter wasn't loud or fast. It was slow, a weight carried across frozen ground. It lived in the way someone stirred the fire, in the way a seat was left empty near the wall, in the way a story was told, and then corrected. No, that was the year after he got sick. But grief didn't mean weakness. It meant memory. And memory, like fire, had to be tended. So peasants learned to mourn and continue, to weep softly and still gather wood, to ache and still survive. Because, in the long winter, both sickness and love lived in close quarters. And to care, truly care, meant risking the ache of loss every single day. Children were not spared from the cold. They were born into it wrapped in wool, laid upon straw, and swaddled not just in cloth, but in expectation. In medieval villages, childhood was not a time of idle play. It was preparation for work, for endurance, for repetition. A child might be only 5 or 6 and already tasked with carrying water, feeding chickens, sweeping ash from the hearth. Not because parents were harsh, but because survival demanded many hands. Winter accelerated that learning. It didn't wait for birthdays or milestones. The child who once played near the stream in summer now fetched frozen buckets from its edge. The girl who once watched her mother spin wool now held the spindle with numb fingers, mimicking motions learned by watching. There were toys sometimes, a carved doll, a bundle of cloth tied with twine, a spinning top made from a shaped bone. But in winter, even play was muted. Fingers too stiff to grip, feet too cold to chase. The games turned quiet, counting games, whisper songs, shared giggles under the blanket pile. And yet, children brought light. Their laughter, though rare, reminded the family that not all was shadow. When a toddler discovered the frost on the window pane and traced shapes with sticky fingers, the room felt briefly warmer. When an older brother whispered a joke to his sister during supper, the fire seemed to burn a little brighter. Parents taught their children not just with words, but with example. A boy watched how his father sealed a crack in the door with straw. A girl saw how her mother wrapped the soup pot with cloth to keep it hot longer. These were not instructions, they were lessons written into rhythm, repeated daily. Children asked questions, of course. Why is the sun gone so long? Why does the wind scream at night? Will we always be cold? And parents answered as best they could, often with metaphors. The sun is sleeping. The wind is looking for someone who forgot to shut the door. No, little one, the cold will pass. Sometimes the answers were lies, but necessary ones. Because children needed to believe in warmth, not just of the hearth, but of the world. They were also taught to notice. The fire's getting low. Mother is coughing again. The hen is limping. These observations weren't idle, they were vital. A watchful child could save a household a great deal of trouble. And so they learned to listen, to observe, to move when needed, and be still when not. Even grief came early. Many children buried siblings or elders, or even parents, before they were old enough to count seasons. But grief, too, became a teacher. It taught the value of closeness, the sacredness of shared bread, the miracle of waking up beside someone who woke up too. Despite everything, the cold, the hunger, the dark children in the medieval winter grew. They did not just survive. They absorbed. And what they absorbed, they would one day teach. The lullabies they once fell asleep to would be sung by their own tired lips. The tricks of layering cloth and banking fires would become second nature. And the fear would become knowledge. So when you think of the peasant child, curled beneath the blanket of scratchy wool, eyes wide in the night, ears tuned to wind and fire, and breath do not see only fragility. See memory in the making. See resilience being woven. See the future learning how to keep the past alive. In the world of the medieval, peasant senses were sharp, not by design, but by necessity. You smelled things before you saw them. You heard them before you touched them. And in the deep hush of winter, scent carried meaning in ways the modern world has long forgotten. Winter had a smell. It was not fresh or clean or crisp like modern advertisements suggest. No, it was older, denser, earthier. It was the scent of damp wool, of smoke that clung to every surface of wet wood and burnt ash and animal breath. It was the smell of people packed into tight quarters with fires that never quite stopped smoldering. Every object in the house held odor. The wooden spoon you used to stir the stew. Smoky, the cloak you wore each day. A tapestry of scent, sweat, frost, and lard. Even the straw beneath your bed carried a musk, mold, old dirt, the faint scent of goat. To the outsider it might have seemed unpleasant, but to the peasant it was home. You knew your home by its scent. A change in it could mean something was wrong. A new draft, a dead ember, spoiled meat, illness, even fear. There were smells of warning. Smoke that turned too bitter. The sharpness of something rotting that shouldn't be. The strange sweetness that sometimes came before fever. But there were smells of comfort too. Boiling barley, fresh bread on a good day, the tang of vinegar used to clean. The sharp bite of herbs burning near the hearth. Scent was also memory. The way your mother's cloak smelled after a long day outside. The scent of your father's hands after sharpening a blade. The dusty smell of the prayer book the priest brought on feast days. The breath of a newborn lamb pressed against your chest. These were not details lost to time, they were landmarks in a world made of sensation. And scent told stories. A neighbor's house, when you entered it, spoke without words. You knew who had a pig indoors, who still had garlic, who had gone too long without clean water. In spring and summer, flowers returned, but in winter, the world was stripped bare. So the few fragrant things left, dried lavender hung above a door, or rosemary bundled with prayer, became sacred, preserved, passed from hand to hand as blessings. Perfume was not a luxury. It was survival. A fragrant herb pinned to a cloak might mask the stench of illness. A piece of pine tar might chase away lice. Even a sprig of mint, if chewed, might ease the stomach after days of root soup. Children, too, learned by scent. They knew the difference between good smoke and bad. They could find their mother in the dark, guided by the smell of bread and cloak and fire. They buried their noses into wool, when afraid not just for warmth, but for familiarity. And sometimes when the night was long and sleep did not come, a person might lie still and simply inhale, smelling the room, the people beside them, the fire, the future. Because even when the world was frozen, scent moved. It reached into corners. It stirred memory. It reminded you that the house was alive, breathing, smoldering, enduring. And when spring finally came, when the first breeze blew through the open door, the new smells were overwhelming. Dirt, grass, rain. But even then, in the warmth and bloom, a peasant might pause and miss the scent of winter, harsh, crowded, sacred. Because it smelled like survival. There was a moment each winter when the world stopped moving, not metaphorically, not poetically, but truly. It happened after the first deep snow, when the wind had finally wandered off to disturb some distant forest, when the sky turned from slate to white, and the flakes began to fall not in a flurry, but in silence. Snowfall in a medieval village wasn't romantic. It was heavy, slow. It blanketed everything with a quiet that felt absolute. You could hear it, not the snow itself, but the absence it brought. No birds, no hooves, no chatter. Just stillness pressing on your ears like wool wrapped around your head. The rooftops sagged beneath its weight. The fences disappeared. The path to the stream was no longer a path, it was just white. The horizon blurred. The trees held still, their branches dipped low, as if bowing under the hush. Inside the peasant house, no one rushed to the door. Snowfall was not a spectacle. It was a sign that now things would get harder. If you hadn't chopped enough wood, if your roof was patched in haste, if the animals were too thin, if your grain sacks were torn or your boots cracked or your chimney still smoked, you would now begin to pay the price. And yet, there was a strange peace in that silence, a kind of breath held between seasons. The snow changed sound. A step outside didn't crunch, it hushed. Footsteps became suggestions. Voices carried farther but quieter. The clank of a pail, the creak of a door, they became events. Not background noise, but markers of life. Children whispered by instinct. Mothers stirred pots without a word. Fathers moved slowly like their boots were afraid to offend the floor. And time unraveled. Hours lost their names. There was no late afternoon, no early morning, just light and not light, warm and less warm, sleep and not sleep. The snow outside was the clock, and it rarely hurried. For some, the snowfall brought fear. Fear that the walls wouldn't hold, that the cow wouldn't last, that the silence meant something was already gone. For others, it brought calm. A moment to exhale, to sit by the fire and listen to nothing, to let the silence wrap around your thoughts like another woolen layer. And that silence taught things. You noticed the way the flames moved when the wind shifted even slightly. You counted the drips from the ceiling. You watched how the smoke curled inside before escaping. You learned in stillness what your house was trying to say. The snow told stories too. It carried tracks, a fox perhaps, a bird, a neighbor with a limp. Each print a sentence in a language made of pressure and melt. The fresh white became a scroll, clean each morning, rewritten each day. Some peasants believed that heavy snow trapped spirits beneath it, the bad ones at least. That as long as the ground was sealed in white, the restless dead could not rise. And so the first deep snow was sometimes greeted not with groans, but with small prayers of thanks. Not that it made things easier. Nothing was easy, but it made them quiet. And in a world where survival depended on motion, snow gave permission, even if just for an afternoon, to be still, to stir the pot slower, to sow in silence, to stare into the flame and think of nothing in particular. Because soon the thaw would come, the snow would recede, the path would reappear, the animals would stir, the quiet would break. And so when the snow came, they let it fall. And they listened, and they waited, and they endured. As always, ice was not just a surface. It was a seal. In the dead of winter, the stream that fed the village, the one that trickled through moss in summer, that carried tadpoles and laughter, now lay frozen, not glassy like in fairy tales, opaque, cloudy, with cracks that formed spiderwebs beneath the surface. To walk across it was to test your life. To hear it groan beneath your boots, even just a little, was enough to make your breath halt mid-air. Children were forbidden to play near it, though some did sliding stones across the surface until they skittered into silence or cracked the sheen and vanished. The ice was both friend and threat. It preserved food and natural larder if you dared cut into it. Some villagers dug holes into the stream to store sealed pots of lard or vegetables. But the ice had to be watched. It shifted. It broke without warning. It didn't care if your foot or your hand followed it down. Fetching water became a task wrapped in ritual. You carried the same path. You broke the same hole. You poured slowly so your hand didn't freeze to the handle. You covered the hole after with straw or cloth to keep it usable tomorrow. And the sound of ice was like no other. Some nights it cracked from deep within, echoing through the valley like distant thunder. Not loud, just low. A rumble that reminded you something beneath is still alive. Because the stream never truly stopped. Beneath the ice water moved, slowly, quietly, relentlessly, like time itself. And when the thaw began, not all at once, but in suggestions, it felt like awakening. A drip here, a trickle there, a patch of exposed mud near the edge of the field. The ice turned soft at noon, then froze again by dusk, then softened again the next day, and this time stayed soft longer. You could hear it, the whisper of meltwater beneath your boots, the shifting of snow on rooftops, the first splash of a drop from eaves to dirt. People began to move differently, still slow, still tired, but with a new tension, not fear, but readiness, as if spring were a guest known to arrive early or not at all. The thaw brought danger too. Flooding, mud, collapse, ice falling from trees like thrown stones. But it also brought relief and confirmation. The stream flowed again. You could hear it at night. The first true sound after so many weeks of silence. Some villagers marked this moment with small rituals. A coin tossed into the current, a piece of bread floated downstream, a bent knee and a quiet thank you. Not to a god necessarily, but to water, to movement, to life. Because the thaw meant something no fire ever could, that the world was waking up, that you had made it through. And though there were still frost to come mornings where breath hung heavy and boots cracked at the seams, the worst was passing. The river carried the proof. You could see it, you could hear it, and finally, you could believe it. It didn't arrive with trumpets. There was no announcement, no feast, no celebration. But one day, sometime after the snow had grown thin and the wind had lost its bite, a medieval peasant would step outside and something would feel different. The first warm day was not truly warm, not by modern standards. It might still frost by nightfall, the ground might still hold ice beneath the topsoil, but the air would carry a softness that had been absent for months. And in that air, things began to move. The mud returned first. Where once there had been crisp snow and packed earth, now there was softness. Heavy boots sank, footprints stayed. Children, at first frustrated by the mess, soon learned to chase one another again, slipping and shrieking and laughing through the thaw. Shoes were dried more often now, hung near the fire, not because they were frozen, but because they were wet with new life. Cloaks, too, began to shed their layers of smoke and grease and salt. The animals stirred, not just in body, but in temperament. The cow lowed more often. The chickens scattered farther from their roost. The pigs, sluggish and silent all winter, began to root and snort with curiosity. And people moved, not with speed but with rhythm. The kind of movement born not from panic or preservation, but from habit returning. A man took his hoe from the corner of the home and inspected the handle. A woman checked the garden patch not for growth, but for possibility. Children stood at the edge of the forest again, watching for birds, foxes, or wonder. Clothes were aired, held up to the weak sun and beaten gently with sticks. Not cleaned exactly, but renewed. A chance to let go of the winter's weight, to shake free the dust and ash and memory of long nights. Inside, the fire still burned, but smaller, less frantic. Its role was changing, less protector, more companion. Meals changed too. The last of the root vegetables were brought forward, the jars of preserved berries examined for mold. Someone might mention eggs again and mean it. And the sound of tools returned, not loud, not constant, but present, a grindstone, a repaired gate. The distant thud of something being split moved prepared. Hope was not spoken aloud, not yet. That would tempt fate. But it was there in the way a door stayed open just a little longer. In the way someone paused to feel the breeze on their face. In the way a child ran across the field and did not fall. And memory began to shift. Winter, so sharp in its pain and precision, began to soften. The days blurred, the nights faded. The ache in the hands and knees became just another story. They had made it, or almost. The frost might still return, a snow might still fall, but the thaw had begun not just in the ground, but in the spirit. And like seeds not yet sown. The peasants of that village, cold-tired and quietly grateful, began to move again. Toward the sun, toward each other, toward life. In every medieval village there came a morning when the silence no longer felt heavy. It wasn't that the cold was gone, not yet. The nights still held a bite. The water still steamed in the pail. But the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of survival. It was the quiet before beginning. The peasants moved with new purpose. Slowly, yes. Carefully. But the difference was unmistakable. The tools were brought forward, not because they were needed that moment, but because they soon would be. Rust was scraped away. Wood was oiled. Blades were tested against leather, not for sharpness, but for readiness. The ground, too, was tested. A finger pressed into the edge of a field. A heel ground into thawed earth. A small nod. A quiet word. Soon. The animals were let out not far, but far enough to remember what space felt like. Chickens darted forward, awkward in their excitement. Goats stretched their legs. The cow turned its head toward the wind and blinked, as if recognizing something it had forgotten. Inside the homes, things were rearranged. The heaviest cloaks were folded. The bedding fluffed and moved closer to the wall. The fire still burned, but it was no longer worshipped. It had done its duty. Now it rested. Conversations began to change. Less about warmth, more about work. Did the neighbor's ox survive? Will the blacksmith take repairs this week? Have you seen the alder trees budding? Children played louder. Their voices carried farther. Their feet dared the edge of puddles, and they no longer shrank from the chill. They shouted to each other again, not in fear or caution, but in play, and the sounds returned. The birds, hesitant at first, perched higher in the trees. The creek gurgled like a throat clearing after a long sleep. Wood cracked not from the cold, but from being split for spring. Even the smells changed. Smoke faded into wet earth. Mold gave way to moss. Something green, something alive drifted through the cracks in the door. The people changed too. The lines on their faces didn't fade. The ache in their joints didn't vanish. But their eyes lifted. Their voices stretched. Their steps leaned forward instead of inward. They had done what they were never praised for. They had survived. And now they would do what came next with the same quiet strength. They would plant. They would mend. They would repair what was broken and replace what was lost. But more than that, they would remember. They would remember the nights of shared breath and fire. The way a whisper could warm as much as a wool blanket. The way silence could teach you what matters. Spring would come, not because it was owed, but because it always had. And the peasants, tired, watchful, enduring, would meet it, as they always did. Without fanfare, without celebration, just with hands that still worked, with fields that still called, with hearts that had not gone out even when the fire almost did. And that more than anything was the miracle.